Ever since the first encounter of the ZZAW C1, I have been following this brand. This is Master Bamboo. Today, we're going to take a look at the newest revision of the ZZAW C1. The previous build of my original ZZAW C1 was a custom loop water cooling build. Unfortunately, I did not upload the video to YouTube, but some of you may have seen it. The pink dye of the water and the extra long ATX power supply and extra long graphic card may have left a deep impression. The original C1 changed my perspective of an mATX case. The vertical mounting of the components allows better graphic cards and much longer ATX power supply, and in the same time a mATX motherboard within a very small footprint of your table. But let's face it, the original C1 was not perfect. You may have run into issue where your motherboard VRM or your I/O shield had actually hit the all-in-one cooler. And you may also run into your secondary expander that had hit the exhaust fan. But now, ZZAW has released a revised version of C1, which had extended the width of the case, which allows for better support of the components. Let's name a few. First of all, more room is provided for your all-in-one water cooler, meaning your motherboard VRM or the I/O shield will no longer hit the all-in-one water cooler. Secondly, you may have complained about your graphic card side fan size. The original C1 had only allowed 12 cm fan and it was mounted very flimsy. Now, with the revision, the whole side panel is allowed to be slided out where you can mount a 12 cm or a 14 cm fan with your choice. On top of that, more room is provided so a 25 mm thick fan will no longer interfere with your components. So now you can even use your secondary PCIe expander without worrying about hitting the fan. Additionally, the bottom side had been lifted, where originally some of you may have to use a right angle for your HDMI, DisplayPort, or even your USB connectors. Now, with the lifted space, a right angle connector is no longer needed. Finally, some of the changes that you may have complained for. For example, the Type-C connector and an audio connector is now provided. However, the mounting point of the front I/O shield had been moved to the top, where a Type-A connector, a Type-C connector, and an audio connector has been provided compared to the original one, which only had a power switch and 2 Type-A connectors. So the detailed specs of the ZZAW as follows. Additionally, I want to share with you about the C1 build, specifically how we build it and also the components choices and specifically how we tune the hardware. Since the layout of the ZZAW C1 is quite special, so we want to test the C1 with an air cooler and also an all-in-one water cooler. Additionally, we'll test the airflow with or without a side intake, and also we'll test a side intake with the fan blowing out to see how the airflow is going to affect the component temperatures. For the air cooler, we're going to use a Thermalright SS135, which had gained so much popularity recently. And then for the water cooler, we're going to use the Alphacool Eisbaer Pro, which is a great choice for the 12th generation. For the motherboard, we're going to use the ASUS Prime Z690M D4. For the CPU, we're going to use the 12th gen Intel 12700KF. Now, how we tune it is we're going to overclock the performance core to 5.2 GHz with single core, dual core, and a 3-core load. And when I reach quad core, we're going to use the 5.1 GHz boost. And when the load reaches 6 cores, we're going to use the 5.0 for the performance cores. For the efficiency cores, we're going to lock it to all-core 4.0. For the graphic card, it is an OEM Lenovo 3070 Ti. So much for the intro. Now let's take a look at how the ZZAW C1 revised is built out. ZZAW C1 benchmarks were more focused on the air cooling and the water cooling difference. For the 3D Mark TimeSpy and Firestrike results, the CPU temperature can differ up to 15 degrees in Celsius. The air-cooled results had reached up to 96 degrees, which had led to overheat and overall benchmark results. However, since the GPU condition were not changed, the temperature difference was only about 1 degree Celsius. For the 3D Mark CPU test and the night rate test, the CPU temperature did not reach to overheat temperature, which is rather good. The GPU temperature results in the night rate, which as expected is less than 1 degree Celsius. Now, if we are to talk about gaming performance and gaming benchmark tools, the CPU temperature looks so much better than the previous TimeSpy results for the air cooler. While the GPU temperature wasn't much of a difference, the CPU temperature can differ by 13 degrees Celsius. But overall, I don't foresee any problem there, both air-cooled or water-cooled. Now, if we go to a high heat generation method with the ADA FPU on the CPU only, for the Eisbaer Pro, the first 10 minutes of FPU, the core max or the CPU max didn't even change. But for the air cooler, the first 5 minutes is where it will held. But starting from 10 minutes, the temperature starts to grow. And again, the CPU temperature difference between the air and water is about 10 degrees Celsius. Now, if we run the ADA FPU and the GPU stress test at the same time, the temperature of the CPU has raised. But unfortunately, the SS135 config didn't even last more than 4 minutes. But the highest temperature for the CPU on the Eisbaer Pro was 79 degrees Celsius. As we briefed earlier, we wanted to use a 3 different fan configuration to test the temperature results. But unfortunately, with the FPU and GPU running at the same time, none of the air-cooled solutions were able to last more than 7 minutes, while the water-cooled solution lasted more than 15 minutes and the result didn't change even after 15 minutes. However, out of surprise, if we use exhaust fan on the GPU side, it actually lasts the longest for the air cooling solution. Now, since the air-cooled solution didn't last for more than 7 minutes, let's focus on the first 5 minutes of the FPU and the GPU stress tests. Now, within the first 5 minutes, without the intake fan with the air cooling solution, the heat went through the roof and the CPU got overheated. For the air cooling, the best results came with the fan as the exhaust fan. However, the GPU temperature was a little higher due to the exhaust fan pressure was rubbing the intake from the GPU. And there's no surprise there, the Eisbaer Pro outperformed every single aspect of the air cooler. Well, just to make things a little bit fair, we used the same exact hardware specs and hardware configuration for the air cooling test and also the water cooling test. So it's a given that air cooler will not perform as well as the all-in-one water cooler. But it is also a given that for the ZZAW C1, the all-in-one water cooler may outperform the air cooler by far. So it is also highly recommended that to use an all-in-one water cooling solution for the ZZAW C1 rather than the air cooler. But if you have to use an air cooler, you have to make sure your airflow is very well ventilated, and on top of that, make sure you dial down the CPU specs. Now for the next episode, I may even consider to use the same case to go against the Eisbaer Pro, Eisbaer LT, and SS135 air cooler. Now, thanks for watching. This is Master Bamboo. We'll see you next time.